Hi, this video would focus on stream of consciousness, a narrative technique which became a defining feature of modernist literature. So here we are going to continue our discussion on modernism, and we would try to understand how the contemporary intellectual tradition influenced the early 20th century literature. So let's begin. Stream of consciousness was a phrase which was first used by William James in the book called Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1890. And he described the unbroken flow of perceptions, memories, thoughts, and feelings in the waking mind by using this phrase, stream of consciousness. And it was May Sinclair, a woman writer of the late 19th century and early 20th century, and she was also a student of psychology and an ardent supporter of modernist literature, who used the term stream of consciousness in the context of literary works when she was writing about Dorothy Richardson's novels. Dorothy Richardson was a woman novelist of the late 19th century and early 20th century, who is often considered as an early practitioner of stream of consciousness technique. And Henry James, the brother of William James, is often considered a precursor to the stream of consciousness novels. If we try to trace the origin of stream of consciousness, which tries to focus on the way in which human mind works, and it shows that, well, human mind works in a very unreasonable manner, so to speak, in a very erratic manner. Now, why the novelists of this time were so keenly interested in depicting human mind? If we ask this question, we would go back to the intellectual interest in human psychology, which was taking interest in the work of, or focusing on the works of, Sigmund Freud and Henry Bergson primarily, and many other writers of that time. And in this way, there was a tradition, an intellectual tradition, which was focusing on the ways in which human mind works. So, if we think of Sigmund Freud, we would see that Sigmund Freud, who was born in 1856 and he died in 1939, had a Jewish parentage in Austria, and he is credited with the publication of these books, especially the Interpretation of Dreams, which is coming in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and then the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, then 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, which came in 1905, and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and then Ego and Id. So all these works are continuously foregrounding the way in which human beings think and how they try to repress their desire. And in so doing, they face a lot of trouble. So Freud, in this way, showed that how human mind or human self is a divided one. It is not a unified entity. So it was no unitary normative self to which each of us might conform. So that was Freud's argument. And for modernist artists, human self was fractured and fluid, and they believe that it is constantly in a state of flux. It is changing all the time, And many writers felt that it was no longer sufficient to present the outsides of personalities and the surfaces of mind, unlike realism. And this is how they challenged the very mode of realism, which was very dominant in the 19th century. In my video where I talk about the idea of modernism for the first time with respect to modernity, I remarked that the link to the video is in the description, by the way, and if you are interested you can go to that video and see that I remarked there that modernism developed as a reaction to realism. Now this is what they were reacting to. They thought that realism might have depicted life in a particular way. Whether it was totally realistic or not, that's a different issue altogether. Because we are also depicting life in a real way, in a way which is suitable for us, because we think that the internal events which are happening inside the mind of human beings are extremely important to understand the external things. So whatever thought process is going on inside your brain, whatever ways are there inside your mind which are trying to develop feelings, perceptions, they are more important. So the external events or the external things are just triggers which would set in motion certain perceptions in your mind, and those perceptions are extremely important for the writer when it comes to depicting reality. So if we try to understand the distinction between realism and modernism, we need to admit that probably realism was focusing on what is known as external reality, while modernism was keen to focus on the internal reality. And that is how Henry James, the American author, is trying to justify the psychological realism in The Art of Fiction, which was published in 1884. And it was definitely influenced by the contemporary development in the field of human psychology. So psychoanalysis became popular because of Freud's theories. Psychoanalysis is a particular study, an analytical method which is used in talking about human mind and how human mind functions, how it represses certain desires, and it is again based on the theories of Freud. So it's a set of techniques for exploring underlying motives and a method of treating various mental disorders based on the theories of Sigmund Freud. And it influenced literary criticism, and that's why we get what is known as psychoanalytic criticism. So psychological criticism was already at work, as psychological novels were already there before the advent of the stream of consciousness technique or the interior monologues that we find in the modernist literature. But then it was not the way in which a modernist writing would try to locate or try to talk about human mind. So psychological criticism is a speculative framework that considers literary work as an expression of the author's personality and mind, and there is a romantic theory of literature which focuses on the poet's mind because it is the origin of all ideas, and this was challenged by new criticism, formalism and structuralism. We may have separate videos on this very theoretical method or theory called psychoanalysis. But then if we think of psychological novels, now psychological novel was already there even before Freud arrived, long before Freud arrived, psychological novels were written. Because psychological novel is a work of fiction in which the thoughts, feelings, and motivations of the characters are of equal or greater interest than is the external action of the narrative. So that is what psychological novel is. And in a psychological novel, the emotional reactions and internal states of the characters are influenced by and in turn trigger external events in a meaningful symbiosis. Now, this emphasis on the inner life of characters is a fundamental element of a vast body of fiction. If you consider fiction in a greater sense of the term, it would come to denote the entire corpus of literature, that is, both plays, poems, and novels. Primarily, fiction refers to novels, but then if we expand the meaning of fiction, it would definitely refer to the world of literature. And in this way, Hamlet or Macbeth, all these are psychological studies. Though they are not psychological novels, they are plays. They can be called psychological studies, which we find in literature or in the world of fiction. Samuel Richardson's Pamela is again can be considered as a psychological study, a psychological fiction. Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, and again a work which is remarkable because it was much ahead of its time, and I very briefly referred to Lawrence Sterne in my video where I talk about modernity and the word modern. So Lawrence Sterne was more modern than his contemporaries, and Tristram Shandy was a text which is often considered not only to be modern but also postmodern. So these works were already doing psychological studies. So authors have done psychological studies before Freud arrives in the scene. But then psychological novel developed as a very important genre when there were Freudian theories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It became very, very popular in the intellectual milieu of the West. So many people contend that Dostoevsky's novels or Tolstoy's novels can be psychological. But then Henry James, James Joyce, Marshall Proust, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, they are using this very technique in a very conscious way. They are making it overtly psychological. So here you have to understand the difference between a psychological study that appears in literary works and the development of the stream of consciousness technique. Now they are different than each other, different from each other. How? Because in a psychological work of literature, be it Hamlet, Macbeth, or say Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy or Richardson's Pamela, they are not trying to foreground human mind, or they are not trying to foreground human mind only. So definitely Shakespeare does a psychological study, but then he is doing it in primarily in a very realistic mode. When Richardson is depicting Pamela's problems through the epistolary format, he is doing it in a very realist mode. He is not trying to talk about Pamela's divided self, though Shakespeare's Macbeth is often considered as a study of a divided self in certain ways if you read it, but then it more depends upon the reader. But in case of James Joyce's Ulysses, or say A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, his earlier work, or Finnegan's Wake, you need not worry about the fact that whether it is a psychological novel or not. It is definitely a psychological novel because it is trying to emulate the erratic manner in which human mind functions. For instance, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, written by James Joyce, you will find that how the narration changes as Stephen, the hero of the novel, grows. So